Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. My name is Catherine Huffman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Square One Project at the Columbia Justice Lab. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this keynote event of our fifth and final roundtable on the future of justice policy. Over the course of this roundtable, which began last week and continues into next week, we're grappling with the values of justice. And tonight, I'm thrilled to welcome our keynote speakers, Marlon Peterson and Daryl Atkinson. Daryl is the founder and co-director of Forward Justice based in Durham, North Carolina. And Marlon is the host of the Decarcerated podcast and the founder and chief reimaginator of the Precedential Group based in New York City. We're really thrilled to have Daryl and Marlon with us tonight. Both of them have been with us from the beginning of the Square One Project's work. Both took part in the inaugural roundtable convening in Durham, North Carolina in the fall of 2018, which focused on our history of racial and economic inequity and its implications for the future of justice. At that roundtable, Daryl and Forward Justice, the organization that he leads, was our community partner. He generously invited us to his home to put the spotlight on the successes and challenges for reimagining justice there in Durham. And he designed and led the Justice in Durham session that we've used as a model for our special local sessions ever since in our roundtables. Daryl has also been a member of the Square One executive session, which has directly influenced the trajectory of these roundtables. And as an executive session member, he's co-authored a forthcoming paper on the power of parsimony, the value of parsimony, with Jeremy Travis. The list of contributions that Marlon has made and continues to make to Square One is lengthy. In Durham, he was a participant in our roundtable and also provided a really breathtaking onstage interview with Melissa Harris Perry. And at our Oakland roundtable, he again joined us as a participant around the table and then took to the stage to interview Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza. He's allowed us to turn the tables on him and become the interviewee in a recent Square One panel on reimagining safety, policing, abolition, and the future of democracy. And the Presidential Group is currently working with Square One on a project to foster discussions about reckoning at the international level. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Marlon also has a book that has just come out, which I hope will be mentioned in the course of this conversation, and is just an incredible addition to the learning and to the conversation about justice in our country. So with all of that, it feels wonderful, just right, to welcome Daryl and Marlon to this virtual stage tonight in dialogue with each other and with all of us about where we've been and where we're headed in this ongoing conversation. Daryl, Marlon, I'm going to hand things over to you both and ask you to consider the question that's front and center in this roundtable. What are the values that should guide efforts to create safety and reduce harm? And can a focus on values contribute to, create a path for, guide us towards a reckoning with the justice system? So with that, I will go off screen and look forward to this discussion, and then we'll be joining back in a little bit later for more conversation and questions. But Daryl, Marlon, thank you all so much, and over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for that, Catherine. Thank you for that wonderful introduction for both of us. Yeah, Daryl, we've been kind of hanging out with Square One for a minute now, huh?
Yeah, they asked for a 3-year blood oath at the very beginning, and they held to their word.
They held to it. I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I was actually coming out of North Carolina. I was like, okay, here we are 3 years. I don't know how long, 2-3 years later. A lot of good conversations obviously had. I got to meet you, right? I heard about you, but never got to meet you. So I got to meet you and obviously other people. So there's definitely some good that came out of this. No, I'm playing. There's definitely a lot of good that come out of this. A lot of people, a lot of partnerships and conversations. So, but how are you doing?
I am well. I mean, personally, I feel really good. I'm about to come off a brief sabbatical, and it was good to be able to unplug and on work. And, really it was timely because my family, we needed to focus in on some things, particularly with the young one doing remote schooling. I can't imagine if I would have been working full time when that was really, really intensive until we figured some other stuff out. So yeah, I mean, maybe I went a little bit too personal there, but That's kind of where my head has been, and ready to, dive back into the work.
Well, I'm happy. I think the personal is where we got to go, right? I mean, not necessarily like, everyone's personal situation. We have to discuss everything, but I think the personal ultimately, the question that they posed, or that is posed, what are the values that should lead to discussions on safety and harm? This is a personal interrogation. This is a personal sort of deliberation that's sort of required, I think. And obviously we are on stage in terms of the current events. I mean, I don't think there's ever a time when safety and harm is not a current event, but particularly now, obviously, with what's happening between the police, the Derek Chauvin and the other police killings and the mass shootings, and just, obviously the continual sad, intra-community violence that we still are experiencing. There was a 7-year-old girl, I believe, that was shot a couple of days ago at a drive-through. So I think, this is personal. There's no way these conversations can be, probably part of the problem in the past is that in the past, for the most part, these conversations weren't personal enough. I think, or at least not personal, or to the people who are directly impacted to it, like the persons and the personalities and the ways that impact people like us. Was not probably, we know it wasn't part of the conversation, and we're still struggling to get up in there as we stand. So, how do we address this then? Like thinking about what are the values that lead discussions on safety and harm. So how about this? I was literally on a conversation right before this with someone, and they asked me, reading my book, and they are, in the media space, but this was a, one-on-one conversation, it wasn't a media conversation. And they asked, well, how do you deal with somebody like a Chauvin then? Right? How do you reckon with that? Safety and harm. Is there redemption for him? And, and I was like, well, it's a critical question, right? I don't think we should be here discussing Chauvin necessarily, but I think that the conversations around safety and harm includes everybody.
Yeah, for sure. And
I people we don't like.
I guess the word that I underlined when the question was reiterated was, what values should animate our system, right? In facilitating, safety and reduced harm. And the operative word is should. We know what values are currently reflected, equity, obviously, and not equality, but equity, where we're really looking at institutions and judging them by the outcomes that they produce. We've talked a lot through our time together with the Square One Project about human dignity, that irrespective of the color of your skin or your zip code or your gender or sexual orientation or how you present, any number of identity factors, that shouldn't be a predictor of how you're going to get treated and what kind of outcomes that you receive from coming in contact with this institution. One that I've thought about a lot, and Jeremy and I have a forthcoming paper, is parsimony, and that's, I think, irrespective of even after the reimagining, right? Let's say we completely wipe the slate clean, abolish, and we come up with some kind of ideal utopian state, right? Because I believe that there still be a function for the state. We've talked about it in our roundtable contexts of the left and right hand of the state, the beneficial, virtuous cycle hand of the state, the left hand, and then the right hand, which can be the punitive hand of the state. And I think the state can serve a positive role in people's lives. Take, for example, our most recent pressing example of vaccine dissemination, right? The state is playing an integral role in to make sure that people get access to this life-saving vaccine. So I believe that the state is going to have a role in people's lives. Parsimony, for at least what we propose, is that it sets the barometer, the restraint on any kind of state intrusion into people's lives, into their liberty interests. So even after we reimagine, I think that value is going to be critical. So those are, I'll stop there, man. Those are a few that I've been thinking about. But it's just funny. I'm on this courts commission, North Carolina Courts Commission, Supreme Court established North Carolina Courts Commission on fairness and racial equity or whatever. And the gulf between these conversations, right, that me and you have it, and the conversations that everyday practitioners who are in the thick of it, who are interfacing with folk every day, is wide and deep. So, those are a few reflections that I have on that question.
Mm-hmm. Listen to you, Daryl, because I want to give some of the things that I think that, the values as well. And I think a good part of it is that the values that you sort of just, shared are some of the values that I have, right? I don't think we have to have different values. I think the goal is here to try to have as many of this. That's the purpose, right? We have as many values in unison as possible. And equity and human dignity are definitely two of the ones that I have. And the other two I have is love, and the other one is forgiveness, right? And I think the one with forgiveness is that, to me, I think just kind of speak on a little bit, is that when we think about safety and harm, like how do we plug in forgiveness into a value to address safety and harm? That can sometimes sound like opposites, right? You can't, how could you think about a value to address safety and harm? How could forgiveness be a part of it? And the reason I'm putting it in there, because I think about values, and that, as you said, so dope, was like you said, you think that we should, you put that should, like you emphasize should, is that like the idea of forgiveness is something that we should. Just imagine a community where no matter what happened, a value that we had at the core of how to address this thing in our community was forgiveness, right? And be clear, forgiveness along with other things, right? And just sort of think about how the approach might be different. I don't know what that is like. I'm just saying that I think that it'd be interesting if that was a core value when we think about safety and harm, because through the work of a lot of people who participated in this in the Square One project over the last couple of years, we also know that this sort of dichotomy between the person who got hurt and the person who did the hurting, particularly when we think about it in our communities, there aren't always these fine lines, right? The person who did the hurting probably had something happen to them or what have you. And that kind of, for me, is, you just imagine what that would look like to address a thing. Like, we led with that. Like right now, we do, just in terms of the state, where the state leads with police. That's what we lead with. We lead with, a hammer. And I'm just saying that, let's say that hammer exists. Let's say that hammer, as you said, there's some utility for the state. Let's say that utility existed, continues to exist. Imagine if it was led differently, with a different sort of core value, with love, with dignity, with equity, with forgiveness. You know what I mean? With parsimony.
Parsimony.
Parsimony. And the other one is not, I don't know if it's a value, because it's not, but one thing I wrote down was root, R-O-O-T. And I think that might be align with everything else here, but when we think about safety and harm, what if also, like, one of the approaches that we could or should have to lead us was, well, what led to this? Like, before we go, you did that or that happened, well, what led to this? Right? And when we led to that, I don't mean necessarily like what happened 5 minutes before, right? Or like, the conversation that happened before the fight or whatever. Like, what led to this sort of, these people, these entities, this person to be in a position where they would be in a place in this type of situation, right? Like, getting to the root of it. Because, our justice system is not created that way, in the sense of like, let's get to the root of what happened, Right? We're not getting to the root of anything. We just want to figure out why you did that crime and how do we prove it and how we punish you for it. There's nothing about what how did that, like what got this person to that place. There's not enough time. The bureaucracy wouldn't allow for it, right? The way we work. So I think about those things that could lead us. But the other part of it is like, when you say should, I'm curious then, like, should also connotes a level of, I don't know if it's reluctance, difficulty, like what's the, because I think should is what the proper word, right? Because we're humans, but like what do you should, like why did you particularly single that out?
I mean, I focused on it because it seemed, I think you're hitting it right on the head, Marlon. Is conditional, right? It is, oh, we should do this, but if we don't meet this mark, we tried really, really hard, right? I would submit it should be a must. Our system must reflect these things, right? To make them, absolute requirements. And you mentioned, the how do we deal with different concepts of restorative or therapeutic or transformative justice in the context of officer involved killings, right? And it's funny, man. I've come up with this concept, like they should be at the back of the line for that. It should be available, but they should be at the very back of the line, meaning that we should be trying, because it always seems like when the innovation comes, and we've seen some of this with law enforcement assistance diversion, when the innovation comes for the lighter, kinder, gentler way, it ends up benefiting white folks. It ends up benefiting folks from majoritarian societies, right? So let's not do that this time. You know what I mean? Particularly if we're talking about offering different kind of restorative or therapeutic approaches to violence. But, is, I think, something that you really hit on that I'm glad you introduced as a value is forgiveness, because I think what is in tandem with forgiveness is the idea of reconciliation. You worry about forgiving folks who you ain't gonna deal with no more. If you're gonna banish them to Patmos, to exile, and lock them away and put them in tiny little boxes for 23 hours of the day where you don't have to deal with them anymore, you don't ever have to confront anything about forgiveness. So restoration and reconciliation, I think, is the flip side of that coin of forgiveness. And what if we imagine a system that we knew from the very beginning, no matter what nobody did, they weren't going to be banished. They were going to be held accountable, but they weren't going to be banished. They were going to be part of the community, which forces them to confront what they did and center the survivor and what their needs are as far as any potential transgression. But if we set our system up like, okay, we ain't throwing you away, you're going to have to deal with this, we're going to have to deal with this, and we as a community and society are going to hold you accountable while also setting up a pathway to reconciliation.
First, I want to say you went deep in like the Bible or wherever when you said Patmos, like you you went deep in there. I haven't heard about use Patmos in a regular conversation in a minute. So that was dope. The idea that when you think about the mere fact that like prison is banishment, right? That's what it is, right? And that's how we deal with it. And it is a way, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't have to, in a way, we don't have to worry about, not only do we have to worry about the person necessarily, but we have to sort of idea that we also don't have to worry about the problem in the first place. We think we can incarcerate the problem, right? And the problem is more than just the person who did the thing or the people that did the thing or the crew or whatever it is, right? But, I just kind of wonder is, kind of going back to the, dimension of the state. Do we even think the state is capable understanding not only how its corporate culture, one, as any business, any institution, there's a corporate culture to it, that people fall in line with, is it equipped to adjust its values to the ones that we are speaking about? And as a B part of it is like, should they be the entity? Should they be in a position to even adapt to these values? Like, should we be asking them to adapt to these values? And like, is there still utility in them if we have these values leading us as a society? Like, if we have dignity, human dignity, equity, parsimony, love, forgiveness, root, if we have those things, the values that lead us to society, do we still need that entity?
And when you say that entity,
so I think about the state. So in this,
are you talking about the carceral arm of the state?
The carceral arm of the state, law enforcement. Like, do we need that then if our society is led by these things?
Yeah, I mean,
and we're dreaming a little bit, right?
So we are dreaming a little bit, but I'm gonna reflect it back to some of my personal experiences. Right, when I was incarcerated, I was incarcerated at an institution, St. Clair Correctional Facility. 60% of the population had life without parole. It was a very kind of dark and hopeless kind of environment, right? And if you didn't have life without parole, you had a lot of time. And so I got sent there because my custody level got jammed up. I got into a couple of scrapes inside. And one thing I remember from that experience, being around all of those men who had that much time, who we have banished, right? There was a very, very small percentage that, I guess, if you DSM-4 or whatever, would be categorized as sociopaths. I mean, literally do not play with others in the sandbox, right? But then the rest of the folks were malleable in some sort of way. So let's say 95% of the folks are malleable. We can deal with them in all types of different manners of accountability to facilitate behavioral modification and productive pro-social involvement in society, right? But then there is a slither of the population that, Marlon, I understand the utopian dream of those things and then the outcomes that society would produce. And I agree with you. But during that bridge, I do believe we gonna have some folks that have been so damaged by the failures of our institutions that I would not want my mother or my wife in a dark alley with them. And that's just a straight up truth, right? But that's a very, very small percentage. Now, do we need, to your question, do we need a state entity to somehow oversee how we're going to deal with those folks? Or are we talking about very communal kind of responses? Each community comes up with its own kind of set of criteria on how they're going to hold folks accountable and things of that nature. I was reflecting on my time reading Things Fall Apart and just some of the practices that they put in, that were elicited in that book with regards to harm. It was, interesting reflecting on that. Can all of those things be on the menu of options? I think so. This is the part that this is the part of the muscle of our movement that we've underutilized because we have focused so much on what we're against. It's so hard to even envision what we're for and how we want to set up that for.
I was thinking about, because same thing, my time inside, there's very few people who would be in that category, like, a sociopath. And that's, incarceration is the world, just the world inside of a cage, in a concentrated cage, right? As you were talking about that, those group of people who would be like not malleable, who might be incorrigible even, right? I think about the person I think about right now is in current, headlines. I think about the DMX. And like I was watching an interview that he did on YouTube, maybe, I don't know, it was not too long before he passed. I don't know. It was definitely maybe this year. And he was talking about, telling stories about all war stories, war story when he was inside, when he was home, and, and even recent history. And X is somebody who got a rap sheet longer than, the Nile River, right? Somebody who he spoke about it, robbery, burglaries. He was making jokes about, well, I prefer robberies over burglaries. Like he's in that, he's kind of joking about it, right? Like there's a risk factor. Like I'd rather do a robbery than a burglary. And he defined why he would. The point I'm getting to is that the one mitigating factor for DMX from being that person who we would not want to have in a dark alley potentially is the fact that he got money, that he became, he found his talent, or he realized his talent. He was committed to the talent. Obviously, he had to be a commitment to the talent and honing it. And the talent took him in places that it took him out of the alley that he would probably be waiting on, because he's probably somebody who was in the alley. The point I'm getting to is that, and things like, I'm not saying money is in no way am I injecting that money is a mitigating factor necessarily. I think coming out of poverty is a mitigating factor. I don't think like an abundance of money is a mitigating factor necessarily. But what I am saying though is that, like, for somebody like him who in and out of the system, who likely, if he didn't find rap, would be continuing to do the things that he was doing since he was a child, there was still a way out for him, right? He still found a way out. And it was a different type of support. And we also know that, we also probably even assume, it might be a little bit presumptuous, but we can assume that incarceration was not helping him, because he had a lot of chances. The prison system had a lot of opportunity to correct him, right? Correctional facility. They had a lot of chance. They kept, from his childhood to his adult year to just a couple years ago, they had opportunities and they failed. But somehow they had something else that got him to where he was, right? I'm just like, for that small bucket in terms of what we want, there's a part of what I think even his life shows like what we wanted. We wanted somebody who could speak about their trauma, right? Who could not act out the worst parts of their trauma anymore, right? And it seemed like his music was his outlet, right? That was his art. His art was his outlet. This is a long point I'm making. I'm just thinking that, one, even for the small bucket, not putting people who may have serious mental health issues in the case of, let's say, a sociopathology, right? But the other folks who may be even somewhat incorrigible, like even that small bucket that's left, even in jail, those people they're not static, like they don't remain that way, right? For the most, they come home, they get the different things that happen, right? They get they join this program, they find religion, they get married in jail. Like there's different things that change people, right? That allow them to evolve. And I'm just saying that I think what we want, there are models for what we want that are in existence. That's what I'm saying. Like if we was to look at a case study of like an X, right? And I think that's a very good case. I hope there's some PhD somewhere on this right now, probably, working on that right now. But like, there is a model for how we can work with people who may seem incorrigible. X is somebody who I can see would be incorrigible, even as a 50-year-old person, right? But he had other things to that helped save him. You know what I mean? I just think that we have models around us and people, like we had a conversation around with like somebody like an X, for instance, like a conversation to like, what was the thing? What were the pinpoints? What were the things that prevent you from continuing to rob and steal or whatever, or to be committed to rap, right? Because he had to be committed. There's a part of him that had to be committed to that and not committed to robbing people anymore, right? And that happened. Like, what was that thing? Could that thing exist? I think there are buckets of, there are examples in the people that we know that can teach us, that lead us to what we want. And it's not easily evaluated, right? It's not easily evaluated. I think about all our researchers on the call, who's listening right now. You may not be able to evaluate it and put it in, an evidence-based model, right? And not taking away the value and utility of those things, but I'm just saying that we don't put enough value on the things we can't quantify. Quantify. We don't put enough things. We don't put enough value on those things. Because here's the thing. I'm gonna end off here, Daryl, is that just about the nature of the prison that you were in, right? You was in the max, right? I did time in the max. The very idea of being in a maximum prison is that these people who are in a maximum prison are all the worst of the worst. That's how society views all of us. You in a max, a maxi max? Oh, then, and I'm just saying that there were things that there are people who saw us as incorrigible. That was a lie. I know I spoke for like 10 minutes. My fault on that. I don't usually do that. I usually don't do that.
No, you all good. I'm gonna throw out a couple of these terms that Suki sent us and to get your reaction. Reckoning.
Yeah, reckoning. Reckoning is hard work. It is extremely hard work. And that's what comes to me. I think about it. I like to add a word in front of it. It's somewhat alliterative, but like root reckoning, right? Like that's even harder work, because you're trying to get to the root of why it is things that happen, why you do things, why people are doing things this way, et cetera. Or in the case of America right now, we're calling this a racial reckoning. That's what people have been calling it over the last year. I debate it. I question that, but that's what we call it, a reckoning, a race reckoning here.
Well, say a little bit more about that, because we may have some similar threads on the race reckoning and you debating. Say more about that.
Police still killing Black folks, right? That may somewhat be reductionist, but I mean, in a way, in a very tangible way, tactile way, that's still happening. Like the reflexes of seeing Black people as danger, the reflexivity of it is still there, right? And I'll give you one example and I'll move on to the next point. 2 days ago, I got this new book out I'm very proud of. I walk into a Barnes & Noble in Manhattan, and I'm in there to sign, right? Speak to the manager, signing books, she's placing it up in the front and all that sort of stuff. And I'm standing right next to the manager or employee. I'm assuming she's a manager. And while she's there with a Barnes & Noble name tag on, like an apron, apparently that they have them wear, and I'm there regular. Actually, I might have had the same hoodie on. And my book is in her hand. A white lady walks up to me, taps me on my shoulder and asks me, has a sheet, a paper, and with a list of books, and asks me to ask her where she can find the books. She thought I worked there. She couldn't even assume that I might have been a customer even. The reason why I bring that in is the reflexivity. That was a reflex of hers. I'm not saying she might have been one of the good white women out there, white people that's out there fighting for us. I'm not denying that, but there was a reflex in her, right? That could not see me as the person whose whole ass face is on this book, right? It would have interrupted part of her conditioning. And so when I say I question it, I don't know if we've gotten to the reflexivity of the issue of race in this country, of racial oppression in this country. We're in a place where we speak about systemic stuff, but I don't know if we got into the place of how reflexive. Some people might want to call it implicit bias. We got all those nice terms. I get it, and I appreciate those terms and not knocking them. But that reflexivity is why somebody can say they mistook their taser for a gun. There's a reflexivity in that this person is a huge danger. Anyway, so root reckoning, I question it.
Yeah, you mentioned looking regular. Recently, both me and my wife were able to get vaccines, and it afforded me the ability to do some things that I had not been doing, such as getting a haircut. And but nevertheless, when my hair was grown out and I would have to take my daughter to the doctor, I would get treated different. I noticed I was getting treated a little bit different. So when you mentioned looking regular, that struck a nerve. The idea of this racial reckoning, I think it's both yes and no, and I'm agree with you largely on some of your critiques around some of the rhetoric around racial reckoning without a whole lot of demonstrative changes in actions, if you will. And some things are starting to shift in the popular culture. And I was, because we got vaccinated, my mother got vaccinated, and we were able to, let her see her granddaughter for the first time in about a year and some change. And I was talking to my mom, and I use her kind of as my informal focus group of, just look, run of the mill Black folk, right? So anyway, I'm talking to her about concepts around defund and this, that, and the other, and we happen to be watching Grey's Anatomy, and that particular show, that episode, the folks in the hospital, it's a hospital show for people who may not watch it. Folks in the hospital were responding to people who were hurt at a protest. Felicia Rashad was one of the characters. In fact, for folks who don't know, she was the wife on the Cosby Show, and Claire Huxtable, and she had gotten shot with a one of those munitions, and it had got lodged in her shoulder. And all of the discussion around the police response to the people who were coming into the hospital that particular day was negative, right? It was not law and order, what you're going to do when they come for you. And I can remember when the law and order and the cops and that whole kind of perspective of law enforcement was the predominant and the only perspective that you would get in popular culture about the role that law enforcement played in people's lives. So I highlight that Grey's Anatomy example to talk about there is some shift in popular culture around certain aspects of whether it's policing and our prison system that are not the same as they were 20 and 25 years ago. And I think we have to acknowledge that. The racial reckoning, we're hearing more conversation about institutional racism, systemic racism, white privilege, things of that nature. But what's absent is a critique around capitalism. And if you know anything about the history of this country, those two things have been inextricably bound since the very beginning of this country. Slavery, African chattel slavery was an economic decision.
Racialized capitalism.
Yeah, racialized capitalism. So I don't hear as much of a critique, even in, some of our most progressive, circles, right, around capitalism with as much vehemence, which is much targeted kind of interventions as I do around anti-racist efforts, particularly the manifestation of racial violence that police forces impose on Black folk.
Yeah. I mean, I think the part with racialized capitalism is that, we all are complicit in it in various ways. That's one, right? In terms of it, right? We all complicit. I think, not everyone accepts that, acknowledges that, understands what that means. That's one thing. And the other part of it is that, and because we are somewhat complicit in it, it's kind of like what holds our society together in a sense. Like when you think about racialized capitalism, like the things that we benefit from don't necessarily the tangible things that we benefit from don't necessarily benefit us, really. But we benefit, we get things out of like this, even the system of racialized capitalism. We get things out of it. It allows everybody can have measures of benefit from it in a way. But there's definitely certain groups of people who are harmed by it the most. But I also think, kind of going back to the, kind of back to the values thing, like all those values that we spoke about, the equity, I'm gonna keep saying for people, the equity, the human dignity, the parsimony, the love, the forgiveness, getting to the root. Can those things exist in a racial, in a society where we have, in a racially capitalist society? Like, can those things exist?
No.
Fully in society? I like that.
I don't need to add no more words.
No, that's how we do it. Nah, I'm feeling that. No. You wanna, like, what's the elaboration on that?
And that's the part that's also really, really hard as well. In addition to seeing our way out of structural racism and envisioning a new world and how the criminal legal system could interface with, BIPOC communities. We got to see our way out of capitalism too. I mean, it's no other way. I mean, it is, show me where it's worked for Black and brown communities. Just show me, give me the evidence, and maybe I'll be persuaded. And I think of it, Marlon, because I'm certainly not a purist, I'm benefiting as well. But just like I try to reduce my carbon footprint, I try to reduce my capitalist footprint as well. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to acquire as much as some. So I just think it's once again, an underdeveloped muscle that, in addition to these alternative systems of control that we're considering, we got to think of alternative economies as well, because they're linked together.
It's interesting. I'm just kind of thinking, kind of in my head, seeing the chronology of this conversation that we have, and how it started off with actual physical harm, right? You're thinking about, happens in a community, someone does this thing, and now we're at the place where we're speaking about racialized capitalism. And in this very moment, we're modeling getting to the root. We're modeling how to approach it. Right? Could we, for folks listen to us talk, is that the crime that we see in our neighborhoods and our community is so much deeper than the crime that we see in our community. It's so much different. It's so much deeper than what they did up the block or in that city or in that town, or it's so much deeper than that. In so many ways, the atmosphere that we're in is going to continue creating that thing in various ways, right? That's a byproduct of racialized capitalism. That's a collateral consequence. You want to benefit from it, also know that when you benefit from it, you're going to have this type of society as well. And it sort of makes sense in that in this society where it's like the center of that idea of racialized capitalism has the highest incarceration rate in the world, incarcerates so many of its citizens. In order for America to work, we have to have people in jails or in plantations once upon a time. That's what makes America work. You know what I mean? And that's the reckoning.
So you just wrote a book on abolition. I want to ask you some questions, because it's one of the areas that I'm doing this stuff with the National Academy of Sciences on reducing racial disparities. And it's one of the areas, public testimony, that we heard a lot of energy about. And I'm curious, I want you to talk about maybe 3 things on how we confront these things with that goal in mind, right? Violence. 2020 was the most violent year in the past 2 decades. And 2021 is looking bad as well. I think coupled with that is unfair access to firearms, right? So I can envision a community safety cadre of folks, of social workers going and responding to the incident where, someone's having a mental health episode. But who responds when they got those choppers? Who's going to that call? Because we got so many firearms in this country. And then political education. One of the things that I've been really, really struck by in my work is in working with impacted communities. And I'm talking about communities who are at the center of crime and violence. We had a fellowship program when we elected our newly elected DA in 18 with directly impacted folks from, our public housing authorities, folks who were tenant leaders, community leaders, who was predominantly Black women. And when we were crafting with them what the policy agenda for the first 100 days for the newly elected DA would be, not everything that they proposed was restorative and rehabilitative. Some of it was retributive. And I highlight that we've all been swimming in the dirty pond of not only white supremacy, but of excess punitiveness. And just thereby creating another institution to give community control over a certain aspect of order maintenance, it doesn't necessarily mean that that control would be any less punitive than what some of our institutions and systems are producing, unless we have targeted interventions to disrupt that and make so. So I'm just curious on your thoughts around those kind of three undercurrents and how we address that in the current abolitionist movement.
What's the third point again?
The political education for directly impacted communities. So these responders would actually produce something different. We act like the social work cadre gonna be less racist. You know what I'm saying? We automatically assume that they're gonna be less racist than the police. Maybe they would be less lethal because they wouldn't have guns, but would they be any less racist?
Well, I always when abolition, I'm by no means the leading expert of abolition. I always kind of admit that, right? I'm in a legacy of a lot of people, and I know the names of people. Yeah, we got 9 to 10 minutes. I see we began a few minutes ago. But let me finish my point. But what I would say is this, right? One is that I'm thinking about Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who speaks about this very well and always talks about getting to the root. That's why I spoke about that, right? And abolition is about getting to the root. It's also about what we can create in place of, sort of what you spoke about earlier, like what we need, what we want. That's also what abolition is, right? But kind of getting to the 3 points that you asked about, violence, unfettered access to firearms, and political education, particularly for those folks like us, right? And, similar to us or adjacent to us even. Getting to the root, and abolitionist politics is like always getting to the root. And we think about violence, taking the first 2 points, violence and unfettered access to weapons. The issue of unfettered access to weapons is not a Brooklyn problem. It's not like a Durham problem. It's not it's not an Inglewood problem. It's not a Jackson problem, right? I always think one, there are more guns than there are people in this country. America is the #1 exporter of firearms in the world, and has been so for years, and they increase over the quarantine, over the pandemic, right? Or we increase over the pandemic. And the reason why I bring those two things into the conversation around the issue of violence and unfettered access to firearms is that to deal with this, it's not something that's not a local issue. It's not locally. I mean, we do our advocacy. I'm part of a board of an organization that does work rights legislation when it comes to reducing access to weapons and guns and weapons. But that won't stop this system that depends on that depends on violence. If you exporting guns across the world, you're also dependent that there's violence across the world, right? There isn't like the Olympics of gaming, shooting, shooting isn't a part of the Olympics, even though the sporting of it is not like an Olympic event necessarily, or maybe it is, I don't know. The point I'm getting to is that there is a need, right? There's basic economics, in terms of supply and demand. So I'm just getting to that first, it's part of what we're saying is that, and why we think about abolition and getting to the root of it is also saying that the root of the problems of particularly violence, when you think about violence as a whole and then weapons, is deeply embedded in how we, like the society that we live in. It's deeply connected to the society that we live in. So even in this book that I wrote, I was like very critical of like the society that we live in. I'm not taking responsibility off of us. Like I should not shoot somebody. Like we know, we shouldn't be doing that. We also know there's trauma and there's all these other things happening. But ultimately, we shouldn't do that. And we need to stop doing that. That's why I was a violence interrupter at one point. But also understand that is somewhat futile work in this society. Like we think about racialized capitalism, we also think about a violent society, right? We in that place, we hold on to the Second Amendment more tightly than we hold on to voting rights. That's our value system here. Our value system is not the democracy. Our value system is really deeply rooted in violence. That's where it is, right? So I just want like that's not a Black people problem. That's not a brown people problem in the sense of like we're not fostering that, right? We're not initiating in that, right? And I think, and this kind of leads right into the political education thinking about it, is that like it's important for us to understand, and for people, particularly people who've had this experience, to have a deeper insight into how they ended up where they were at. And it's bigger than, whatever the instant of the crime or the multiple crimes or the offenses. It's so much deeper than that. I say somewhat crassly, but I mean it when I say that, everybody who did a bid don't need a mic in front of them, right? And and the reason why I say that large is not that everybody who had an experience with the carceral state doesn't have a story to tell. Of course they do, right? And they should be afforded the space to share the story in whatever form they want to. But also, like if you don't have the understanding, the insight into the system that you fell into, then you could probably do more harm. You could probably even bolster the system. Right? Like when people come home and they say, man, I'm so thankful for prison. I've heard people say that, and I'm like, oh, you're doing the wrong thing there, because somebody taking that down, writing that down, putting that in the next report. Prison, this person is thankful for that. Obviously, I get a little excited, but this is you embedded a question around abolition. Abolition is not a new term. We all know that. It just gotten much more I don't even say credibility or even legitimacy. It's just spoken about much more now within the last 2 years, maybe, right? And a lot of people want to believe it is a certain illogical, improbable thing. And I'm saying that even kind of like getting back to the book that I wrote, like I didn't write a book, and just answering your question, Daryl, I didn't go into this saying I'm gonna write a book about abolition. That was not my intention. Abolition didn't come into this book until the end. If you read it, the term doesn't even get mentioned until damn near the end of the book. And the title doesn't come in until like the second or third revision of the book in terms of abolition. Like this is a journey to it, right? There's a journey to it. So in all the things, whether it be to violence, in our communities, unfettered access to weapons and political education, like all those things are important, but particularly the last point, the political education is probably the most important thing, because those things can help us as a society in this country deal with the other two things, the unfettered access to weapons and violence. Like that's the most important part, because not only for people who are directly impacted, but our society is not really politically educated. We live in a society that is might be the most advanced, we call that advanced, but we are the least politically educated in this country. We don't believe, and I'm gonna say, and this is my last sentence here, we don't believe that this country was founded on violence. We don't believe it. Like most people don't believe that. And I think that that's a problem in and of itself, because we don't know how we started. We're gonna keep ending up in the same muck that we in. The mere fact that we have these mass shootings in this country. If I was a doctor and I was trying to like checking on a patient, and there's something really wrong with this patient. These mass shootings are they're very indicative. They're telling us something. There's a sickness here that young people are doing. The last one was 20 years old, right? These are young people doing it. These aren't like men our age, jaded, I'm tired of this, I'm tired of the man and all. These are children doing these mass shootings. And if anything, we're not listening to the children. Like the children are telling us something. I said, okay, wasn't my last sentence. What happened at the, on January 16th, I believe it was, or January 6th in DC, where the parents of many of these young people who put where the age of where some of these young people do these mass shootings, they look up to these older folks. These were adults. These were people our age running up in the Capitol. And it's the young people who come from there who have the same ideology of them, who have the same sort of watch the same news or whatever it is. They're younger versions of themselves are the ones shooting up these schools or whatever, churches, mosques. They're the ones who's doing this. And there's a sickness that we just refuse to sort of like acknowledge around, like, it's really telling us something. And for what it's worth, Daryl, the political education part, that if that is not addressed in a real way, the other two things that you mentioned, abolition, reform, whatever what you want to call it, can't do anything.
All right, Catherine, I think you were telling us it was time maybe about 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, that was on me. That was my fault.
There, you are absolutely not. Your timing is perfect. And Marlon, you just teed us right up for the rest of this conversation. Thank you both so much. You have taken us on a journey that is not over through Durham and Brooklyn and Patmos and all over the place to get us to this moment. I want to invite the rest of our roundtable participants to rejoin via video as you're available. Folks will probably start popping onto the screen. But while they're coming on, Marlon, Daryl, just a follow-up question. You were just talking about this problem that we have, and you posed it as a problem, and I think we would agree that it is, that we are more adherent to the values of violence and to the structures that keep us focused on violence than we are on the values that take us to freedom and engagement in community. You put that in terms of the right to the Second Amendment rights in relation to voting rights. There are a lot of, I think, other iterations of that. What do we do with that? What's the path forward for that? Is that the political education that you're talking about, or how do we start to shift that in this moment?
It's a question to us or to the crew, to everybody? It's us, me and Daryl?
Question to you, yes. Give it a start and then others will join in. Sure. Or Daryl, both of you.
Okay. I'll take a shot at it first. No pun intended. I mean, for what it's worth, right? And I'm also somebody who is aware of what's happening in the present. And I do see people, like the mere fact we're having this conversation is, and like, we're not the only ones having this conversation. You and your circles, whatever state you're in, variations of these conversations are happening. And I think variation of these conversations happening is, as you have spoken to earlier, Daryl, like signifies of some level of progress, right? And in air quotes. I think that's part of it. And I think we also should be like, I think part of what we can do is being courageous about speaking up about the things that are outside of the groupthink, right? In the criminal legal space here, as we heard, there's a groupthink. We all know that there's a groupthink in any of these circles, right? And I think it's important for us to be able to step outside of the groupthink of what it is, because those of us here on this call, in this meeting, have a level of political education, probably more so than most people in our society. And so we have a little bit of a responsibility to make sure that we're always echoing these things out. And the unpopular things, and not only unpopular things to the group thing, but the unpopular thing to our own conditioning. Because we are also somewhat conditioned to a certain way of understanding the society that we live in, or our own experience. And I think, it's being comfortable with that, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. I firmly believe that we have to be better at being uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. I recall, and I'll pass up to Daryl, I recall at the first roundtable, that's the first roundtable in Durham, and we had to do our introductions. And I can't remember what the prompt question was, but I know one of my answers was like, I was nervous on the inside because I wanted to say like the word, the A word, right? I remember being nervous. I'm gonna say this A word here. And I was like, oh shit. All right, Marlon, let me drink some water and I'm gonna say it out loud. And the word was abolition, right? And it wasn't like nobody ever said it, but we also know that in some spaces, it was like this term that was sort of like, will let you laughed out of the room, right? And now it's a thing where everybody's discussing it. They got whole websites and, you know, all the things, right? And that's good. That's progress. And I'm not saying I'm in any way to be commended for that. I'm saying that the emotion that I had was nervousness. And I wanted to step beyond the nervousness of saying that out loud in front of people I didn't meet, right? And you gotta understand, in that meeting, I'm now meeting people for the first time, no matter what, even if you did a bid, no matter the mere fact that, and people know about my history, there's this thought that, oh, people may not see me as legitimate because I also got this record. So he might just be somebody from jail is saying it. Like all those things are working up in my feelings. And I was like, let me say this thing. And I'm just saying that like we come to these spaces, it's important to say the thing that might be unpopular, not disrespectful, but unpopular, because we might be saying the thing that needs to be heard. And we see in our society, there are things that need to be heard in our society right now, because if not, well, we know what the end results are also.
Yeah, thank you. Daryl, do you want to add to that? We can call on a couple of folks for questions as well.
What was the initial question again about what's the path forward?
What's the path forward if we want to shift our values from where we see them to where they should be, where they must be, as you said?
Yeah, I don't think America is ever going to change. Ever, 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 ever. And I think it's serious time for, you know, whether it's Black folks, other folks, to seriously entertain going somewhere else that's less harmful. I don't think this place is ever going to be any different. I really don't. And if we ever build the political power, the people power to actually, you know, effectuate where it will be radically different, history has shown us what happened on January 6th was not unique. Every time, look at radical Reconstruction. It happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, when folks exerted their political and economic power. They had political and economic power. Folks came, radical insurrection, and took it. It happened in Utah, Alabama, around the same time. It's happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I don't think this place is ever gonna change. Now, some folks may say, you know, it is, you know, part of my lineage and destiny to help bend it towards some kind of other change. I think all options should be on the table, because what we've seen in the same week that some folks want to equate some measure of quote unquote accountability with the conviction of Derek Chauvin on all counts. In that same week, the very next day, a 16-year-old girl was shot when other methods could have been used, right, to de-escalate that situation and make sure everybody got a chance to breathe another day. I don't think that's ever going to be different here. It's in, as Marlon said, it's in the DNA of this place. Now that leaves us a set of alternatives of what we're going to do, right? And it's interesting when you look at history, the largest membership-based organization for Black folks was Marcus Garvey's organization, and they organized around leaving this place. Because since the moment that we've gotten here, they tried to rape, kill, drown, bomb, shoot, and degrade us in every single way that they possibly could. And do we somehow believe that the historical record, the evidence is going to be any different? So we have to decide on how we're going to respond to that. And I believe everything should be on the table. And also, and that includes looking for other places to live that are less harmful than this. And I understand imperialism is global, racism is global, but they ain't killing Black folks the way they killing Black folks everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, that's a whole word.
Mm-hmm.
So,
oh, go ahead, Marlon.
And I just want to add too, just real quick, that, and I know that leaves us feeling pessimistic. And I think that is something that we should like sit with that, right? I think we should sit with that pessimism, because we're ultimately saying this square one, this whole thing started about dealing with issues within the criminal justice, like how will we do it differently, right? That's how this whole thing started, if I'm not correct, right? If I'm correct. And you came in from the entry point of crime and violence. That was your entry point. But how will we address it if we did everything differently? And what Daryl is saying, and what I'm saying is that in order to do things differently, we got to do America differently. That's what we said. We're literally saying you got to do America differently. You can't like extrapolate it. You can't extrapolate it. You can't, I mean, for what it's worth, there is measures of things that folks are doing that are harm reduction, right? And we're all, no matter where you are, whether you're abolition or not, you are in a place of harm reduction, right? But we also know that the harm is, we're doing the latter part where we're doing the reduction, but we're not really doing anything about the ultimate harm. And I think here we just kind of get to like what Daryl was saying, it's kind of like, it ain't on us. It ain't on us.
What's that really going to be? Yeah. What's that really going to be? I want to invite in Ineka, who had a question, a thought to bring to the conversation. Ineka?
First, just Daryl and Marlon, thank you for your candor and sharing your thoughts and a part of your personal stories with us. Marlon, you talked about being nervous about saying the A word and feeling that people wouldn't take you serious because of your history. And I want to get both of your thoughts on a similar feeling I have about what is the role for people who were system actors, such as myself, who now want to be a part of the abolition movement. I also get nervous saying that A word, having been a system actor, but now understanding based off of what I've seen and what I've witnessed and what I've done, the need for abolition. But wonder what your thoughts are on the role for people who have been system actors in that movement.
I'll go because Daryl will be like, I'm staying away from the abolition shit. I'm gonna talk. I think one thing I'll say, you have something, you have to deal with something that I don't have to deal with. And what's a little bit different is that you may have to rearrange your relationship with some of your past friends and colleagues. And that's just, that's just a reality, right? That's one of the things. And initially I was gonna say you might lose some, and I don't wanna say that. I say you might just have to rearrange your relationship with some of your friends and colleagues for one, right? Because there's a corporate culture that, you were part of at one point. Not everyone is where you're at, and that's just reality. I don't have to deal with that, right? So that's one difference. But I also wanna say like your hair. Like, I mean, if you're here, you here. Like, we ain't gonna, what I'm saying? Like Harriet Tubman said, come on. Right? She said, come on, you come on with me. So come on with us. I mean, I think you're already there. There isn't like an initiation process for this sort of thing. You know what I mean? And the other part of it that we want people to be on the train, right? Abolition is like, I mean, we're going to get stuck around that word and that term, and I get it, and I understand why, and there's utility in that. But also ultimately understand that we want people to live free and safe lives. And we're saying like, this is one way to deal with it. One way we can address that, right? Is understanding one, abolition is saying that like, and reform, whatever. We're also saying that people who have committed the harm has also experienced the harm. So that's why we're saying, let's get to the root of it. All y'all experiencing this harm, let's get to the root of it. That's ultimately what we're saying, you know what I mean? And I think that like when more people understand that's what we're saying, like yourself, right? I mean, that's ultimately, we want people to live free and safe lives. We don't want anything different from anybody else. And we're saying that we don't want to use force. And we're saying we don't want to use force. Why is that not attractive? But anyway, I'm just saying though that like, but people like you who are were system actors, I mean, you're on the process too, right? And I think that, and even if somebody who's currently a system actor, who like might be embedded in the system now, the CO, a cop, or whatever it is, a prosecutor, what have you, there's utility in them in that place too, in disrupting it. You got to figure out where you can disrupt from.
I'm deeply skeptical, Nico. deeply skeptical of currently embedded actors in the criminal legal system claiming that they want to abolish it. They would be abolishing their jobs. They would be abolishing their very professional identities and how they make their money and how they've sent kids to college and how they've gotten pensions and paid for houses. You think about 14 million arrests and all of the criminal legal system bureaucracy that it takes to run that machinery. We're talking about deconstructing a lot, y'all. That's a lot of people who need to find some alternative ways to make some income, right? And I'm deeply skeptical that people will be advocating against their self-interest. What I believe is happening and what I see happening is the system morphing and co-opting and adjusting right in front of our very eyes, right? You're hearing the oxymoron of progressive prosecutors and private prison providers providing reentry services and therapeutic interventions and things of that nature, right? The system is shifting right in front of us, right? Where people are saying, this is how I get to stay in my lane and how I still get to make my bread and how I still get to have my privilege and comfort and benefit off a system that we know is crushing folks. So I'm deeply skeptical of any current criminal legal practitioner saying that they are abolitionists.
What about this though, Daryl? I'm gonna just join us in. I'm sorry, I don't
know.
No,
go ahead, finish up. We have other questions.
But I also know this, right? That if I didn't go to jail, I probably would have took a state job. I would have took all the tests to get the state jobs, right? That's what my brother did, my cousin did. We took all the state tests. They took state tests and they got a state job. One of the state jobs that people take are CO jobs and police jobs, right? And it's just like it's a job. And then when you get into it, that's why I keep going back to the corporate culture. And then, you're taking care of your family, right? And there's obviously a conundrum here, right? And this goes back to racialized capitalism, where you got to take care of your family now. And I work for myself. Everyone can't do that, right? And there's a privilege in me saying that even. But I also understand too that like those folks working, like I have, one of my good friends is a cop. I grew up with, I ride about him in the boat. He's a cop, like a lieutenant, right? But he took a state job. He's the person I first learned how to smoke weed and pull guns with. But he took a state test. I didn't take the state test yet. I went to jail. He took the state test and became a cop, right? And I'm just saying that like, and he can't easily just say, I'm gonna stop doing this job. And you know what I mean? And this is weird, me coming across and trying to give a justification. What I am saying though is that people like him, if he really want to be, on the train, you have to rearrange. There's a rearrangement of your relationships with a lot of people and even the institution that you're in, right? It has to be, because I also understand that capitalism requires that we do things that we slave. Like you got to protect, right? That's what, you got to slave. It's labor. You have to have labor to support yourself. And that's all part of this conversation. That's all a part of it, like the racialized capitalism and in the way this country works, particularly this country, like, sometimes people are in professions out of necessity and not necessarily out of want and need, right? And that's a hard reality to deal with, because particularly when you think about COs, Rikers Island, all the COs, they're Black and they from the block. Like, they're from the block. They hanging out with us and then they go to work, right? And I'm just saying that like, it's a complicated situation. It's complex, but it's not so complex to understand when you committed to a thing, whether it be a DMS committing to his rap or whatever it is. You got to be committed to a thing. And if you're committed to a certain politics, you have to be like that at your job too. And you got to be disrupting in your job too. And at some point, you may have to realize that there are some risks that you have to take that may not benefit you. And you got to figure out how to deal with that also.
Thank you, Marlon, Daryl. We're going to jump around a little bit here just to get in a couple more questions from folks beforehand. And so, no, don't say that. Let's turn to John Simon. I know you had a question.
Thank you both so much. I'm sitting heavily with much that you've said, especially the sense of the enduring feature of American violence, which hangs over both our carceral state and the things that it doesn't accomplish in our society. And the only thing I would say is that there are moments like, the night in Chicago behind me, when American society seems to see violence and see state violence more clearly. And then there's discussion like there was in the Kerner Commission of trying to do something profound about the inequalities that drive it. And it feels to me, I don't want to be too optimistic, like we're in one of those now. It may not be a turning point because there may not be turning points in this game, but I'm wondering what you think about, one, how to keep that open as long as possible before the veil comes back, as W.E.B. Du Bois would call it, over this violence. And also, especially thinking of your book, Marlon, how to extend it to incarceration, because it feels like people see the violence of policing right now, and I'm not convinced they see the violence. I thought COVID would help people see the violence of incarceration, but not so clearly.
Yeah, I mean, if everybody had cameras in prison, your mouth would be on the floor. If everybody had cameras in prison, and we only think about physical violence, think about the sexual violence too, from particularly in women's prisons, right? From officers, right? And those things get lost because we put them away. Going back to our core of what the values are, we feel we can just throw it away. And we won't have to deal with it. But then you have to deal with it. But the people inside have to deal with it, and the COs got to deal with it, and the people and the nurses got to deal. Everybody's dealing with it inside. I mean, yeah, I don't want to tell a long story about it, but anybody can tell a story about it. If you did time, the extent of the violence, like state violence in prison. Like it's common. It's part of doing the bid. It's just like part and parcel with it. And for what it's worth, most of us in society are comfortable with it, particularly when it's somebody who did something particularly egregious, right? We usually say, I hope that person has a hard time in prison. We're kind of saying we want that violence to continue, right? We're not getting to the core of why the violence is there. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you with that, John, in that, we are on a flashpoint now. And here's the thing. Maybe in 30 years, police don't kill Black and brown people as much. Maybe in 30 years, there aren't as many Black and brown people and indigenous folks in jails and prisons. But America has also shown us that it's sort of like this, it's like a shapeshifter. America shapeshifts the same thing, right? We went from, you read the new Jim Crow, right? So I'm just saying, like, we don't know what the next iteration is, but part of the fabric of this country is oppressing certain people in order to win. That's part of how we win. That's the American way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that the perceived momentum, because I'm sure some researcher is going to study the mass demonstrations that happened after George Floyd and quantify how much of that is, genuine kind of allyship in an anti-racist movement, and how much of it was people just wanting to get outside during the pandemic. So I try to read history and try to be a student of history. And what the historical record of this country has shown me is to not get too high about these grand moments of awakening and transformation, because they're really, really fleeting, really, really short. I mean, take radical Reconstruction, for example, 1865 to 1877, and there was mass violence going on in that 12-year period. Take the second Reconstruction, 59 to 71. These are blips in time in the history of this country. And our multiracial democracy, if we want to call that, which happened after the 65 Voting Rights Act, is really, really fragile. So when you look at the history of this country, we really hadn't done multiracial democracy for the vast majority of this country. That ain't who we be, not for real, right? That's been a really, really short moment in our history. So I think the jury is still out on where we're going to go as a society, what this reimagining and this reawakening really is, because we've had these blips on the radar screen of American history previously.
Thank you, Daryl. Marlon, we're nearing the end of our time, so we have two more questions. I'm going to ask Donna and Monica to share your questions pretty briefly, and then we'll let Daryl and Marlon respond to that, and then we'll wrap up our time together with just huge gratitude to everybody. So Donna and Monica, if you guys could share your questions, then we can talk about it all together, and sorry for consolidating folks there. Go ahead, Donna.
Yeah, I had other questions, but now if I'm trying to be brief, I guess I'll just follow on what Daryl was talking about just now on these blips, or this short moment in time that we're now in presently. I mean, I kind of see it as like that's where the hope lives, right? is where we're at now, and in this pluralistic democracy, even as, you know, people in power now are trying to dismantle the opportunity that exists in that little blip, right? By suppressing voter rights and all sorts of other things. And I wonder if you both think, I guess, that there is a real opportunity here with coalitions that are being built with now communities that are increasingly empowered, that are increasingly enfranchised, right, to vote. People who look like our communities, who have the experience, the life experience of the people in our communities, into positions of power where they really can codify policies that allow us to live in a society that is really just for everyone. And I think that in that implicit, and I think it has to be explicit in that, is the experience of African Americans in this country. But also, I think what has to be a part of that is that being a part of a broader collective struggle, of which I think many communities of color, immigrant communities, and other communities marginalized on a number of other kinds of axes are part of. But do you think that we are in a moment where that kind of promise does exist?
Thanks, Donna. Monica, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump in and I'll be quick. I first just want to thank both of you for this really amazing conversation. My question is about abolition and also pessimism, and I want to ask about Chauvin and how you react and deal with, you know, so I'll say, as someone who identifies as abolitionist, I didn't want to do the whole thing of like, well, this doesn't matter. You know, actually, we shouldn't be rooting for prison at all, or something like, even in Chauvin's case, understanding that the meaning of the conviction for a lot of people was hope and a sense of, I don't know, accountability, justice, whatever you want to call it. How do you navigate being abolitionist or being just essentially like an Afro-pessimist, is how I interpreted you, Daryl, given this outcome and not wanting to be the kind of wet blanket with your people or our people?
Daryl, I think that was a question for you right off the bat there. So
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm gonna be consistent and be Daryl Downer here as well. You know, I mean, the verdict, the fact that, I guess the thing I felt the most was, emotion I identified with the most was relief. The fact that that the evidentiary standard has to be an officer kneeling on your neck for over 9 minutes to get a conviction is disconcerting, because as someone who does, you know, civil rights litigation a lot versus police departments, I'm not going to have that most of the time, right? And so, you know, that was a little bit disconcerting. I do have a theory, though, about the prosecution of both more police officers and more white folks, right? I don't want more white folks to go to jail and more police officers to go to jail, because I think it's going to bring survivors back and, you know, offer restorative and therapeutic kind of remedy to them and their families and their communities. No, I want them to go to jail, because I think when more of them feel the pain of prison, feel the pain of the rigidity of our system, right, we might start to see it change for the betterment of other marginalized communities. That may be a little bit warped, but I mean, Derek Bell had this whole, he was a Harvard academician, had this whole entrance convergence theory. It's kind of along those lines, right? That when they start hurting bad enough, right, you'll start, seeing some changes in our institutions and systems. So yeah, that's kind of, how I, navigate that space. And just Monica, for definitional purposes, I kind of consider myself more of a reconstructionist than anything. I see those as discrete periods in time that we can study and learn from to see how we can, continue to advance in this country if we continue to invest in transforming it. Because one of the things I'm weary of, and I don't know about y'all, I'm weary of BIPOC communities putting in the sweat and the labor and all of the hurt and pain to transform and lurch this country forward into being a more perfect union. I'm kind of over that. Let's take our genius and black magic and all of our ingenuity somewhere damn else and help build up their institutions and structures rather than continue to invest in a place that treats us like a red-headed stepchild. And so I'll stop there.
A red-headed stepchild. I'll just I want to, Donna, ask, kind of, and then I'm gonna come to you, Monica, in terms of like, are we in a moment when promise exists? Of course we are. Like this, I mean, we don't do the work we do if we don't have hope, right? I think that's ultimately the question you're asking, like, is there hope? And I always look back I think about the video of George Floyd's daughter on the neck of Steven Jackson, the NBA player. And she's like, my daddy changed the world, right? And she's a little child in how she maybe like 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever, in that around that age. And she's saying that. And I mean, I'm gonna look at her as the person who is an expert of her experience even at that moment. And she has not only does she understands that her father's not here, but she understands that her father may have changed something. And that can hopefully inform her and people like her at her age group to like, we can continue to change something. And there's promise in that video for me in this moment. But I also think that where my Afro-pessimism may come into play is that the way we get better, the way we progress as a society, right? Or bringing in, just more perfect union. Because ultimately that's how, we're in this country. That's how people who would defend us, like we're still in the process of becoming this perfect union, right? And voting rights or extending voting rights to more people, among other things, are ways that we get to that more perfect union. Granted, my Afro-pessimism comes into play is that it's on our backs. We have, quote unquote, better policing than we had in the 50s because Black people had to die, and involuntarily. George Floyd was not a voluntary martyr. He didn't walk out his house and say, I love America. I'm gonna do what I can to make this a more perfect union today. I'm gonna go and let myself be killed by a cop. He didn't do that day. And that's what we forget, that yes, there is progress that's happening, but we are the ones that's dying. Like, we the ones that's dying. It's our health outcomes. COVID exposed that. COVID exposed the fact that it's our health, our comorbidities were allowing us to be more susceptible to the disease. And why do we have these comorbidities? Because of the communities that we were in and the socioeconomic conditions of our communities. And we're going to get better at it. But because we died, we offered our lives. And that's why we're getting better. And that's the problem so that's where the Afro-pessimism comes into play. And in thinking about, your question, Monica, about the meaning of the Chauvin, I emphasize, put in quotes, the meaning. I don't know what that means, right? When it happened, I had gotten the verdict. I mean, I had heard the verdict literally maybe a half an hour after I had left that Barnes & Noble store. I left the Barnes & Noble store and I got the verdict in my car. And I felt nothing. I felt, for what it's worth, I felt more joy when OJ got off. And I was a child then. Like, I felt like something happened, right? And I still believe OJ, that's a whole nother story. But like, in the moment of the Chauvin case, or the Chauvin verdict, I know Vivian and I, we had like a little dialogue on Twitter. I understand that there is relief, a sense of accountability, even particularly, and I think about his family, I think about his daughter again, right? Like there's a feeling like, yeah, you know, the state did right by us. The system did right by us in this moment. And it is, like, I get that. You felt like they felt like they were heard. They weren't dismissed like all the other cases. But then I know that is gonna happen again. So I don't know what it means. I know it's gonna happen. We all know, there's no one on this Zoom right now. If I ask you a question, who believes that another police shooting or killing in some sort of way of an unarmed Black, brown, indigenous person, how many people believe that it will not happen again? Nobody here is gonna raise their hands. So I don't know what that verdict means. I know one thing, that what I do know is that another one of us is gonna die at some point. And we've seen it, right? Somebody here mentioned it, right? And we hope that it's caught on camera. We hope that it's caught on camera, and with such vivid and such rich texture and display as that we had in the Derek Chauvin situation. We don't get that often. And I think if it was a 5-minute video instead of an 8-minute video, if that person had shut their phone up a little, shut it on, put it on a little bit later, or shut it off a little bit sooner, would it be as obvious? The police reports didn't show what happened, didn't speak to what happened. It took somebody to have a video to show that, but the police didn't tell us what happened. I don't know what the Chauvin verdict means.
Marlon, Daryl, everyone, we have to wrap this conversation up, but we are going to continue it tomorrow with our roundtable, and this actually will lead so directly into those conversations. You know, you all tonight, Daryl and Marlon, just such gratitude to you for this time and for your thoughts and for all that you bring to this. You know, you've really, it is Square One. We try to move outside of this pretend narrow justice system into the much broader entire society, the social contract, the broader culture in which we live, and think about these questions. And you've really pushed us to do that and given us a lot to think about as we do going forward. So I will just thank you all again. We'll look forward to rejoining again tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. For our participants, we'll be inviting you all to join a little bit beforehand. And then for our audience who's watching, please join us again. We'll be live streaming starting right at noon, and we'll look forward to having you join us then. Our sessions tomorrow are on the irreducible minimum and abolition, following from our conversation tonight, and on operationalizing the values of justice, guiding principles. What might that actually look like? And does that give us a path forward on any of the questions that Daryl and Marlon have put before us tonight? We'll be hearing from some opening thoughts from Marcia Rincon-Guiardo, Jonathan Simon, Ineka Jones-Tapia, and Danielle Allen. And all of the materials for tomorrow, participants, you've received them directly, and they're available on our squareonejustice.org website. So with that, I will say thank you again to all. Just Marlon and Daryl, we can't thank you enough for the time you've given us and the thoughts you've given us. You're getting rounds of applause there around the Zoom screen.